So we're going to go into some of these fundamentals now. So when we get into this discussion, you have a good basis to kind of think about these issues. So we're going to go through kind of structural design, content, and interactivity items, kind of broken up into those four buckets. So what do we mean by an accessible structure? Well, the structure of your website, like the content management system, whether it's WordPress or Squarespace or something else, those systems can sometimes hurt accessibility or not have features built in to help you with that. So it's important from the get-go, deciding even what system you're going to build your website in. Is that going to be able to accommodate accessibility? Will you be able to have those tools built in? And then there's sort of site-wide attributes like the language attribute, the viewport, and all these things in the code, and kind of the structure of the site defining where the navigation is versus the content in the code is important. And we'll talk more about that. But that's, for instance, when you're using, say, like a screen reading tool, and that tool is converting that text on the website to speech. Say you don't have the structure in there that defines navigation versus content, that user is going to hear the navigation read every time they load a page over and over and over, which is a big hindrance for them to kind of effectively use their site, use the site. And then proper kind of headings and how your pages are laid out in the markup. So many of these software programs and hardware programs really do a good job of chunking up the content and letting someone go through it very quickly if there's headings and lists in the correct structure, and the navigation is defined separately from the body. Those elements that we kind of consider the structure, having those set up right can really help. So this is a tool, and we're going to talk more later about free tools you can use. This is just a screenshot of one tool called ANDI, or I think people will just call it Andy. It's actually made by the federal government. There's this other tool, the Wave tool, which we'll talk about, and these help you test your pages to see, is that structure correct? Do you have the basic structural items in there to help with accessibility? And it will call things out like redundant links, like, oh, you have 5 links in this one area that all lead to the same place. And you may not think of that as a human user visiting your site and not using something like a screen reader. But for people using special tools, that is highly annoying, because they're just going to get the same thing over and over and over, read to them. And then there's also a tool called Lighthouse, which is actually built in your browser, which can also give you a quick score of accessibility and help you kind of see where your structure needs to be fixed or improved. So you'll see in this screenshot too, one kind of structural issue that this tool found that came up is the search. So the navigation is actually okay on this website, and there is the special tags to let you know what's navigation, what's content, but they made a major mistake in the search. The search box uses a little button toggle to kind of open and close it, which I'm not a fan of, but also that is not accessible because there's no description of what that does. So someone using a screen reader isn't going to know that that's the item that will open the search system. So that's just kind of one structural example. Design is a big one, and this is the one that we find most websites struggle with, is making the design of the actual page accessible. So we're talking about color and contrast, font sizes and the fonts you're choosing, and how buttons and icons are used, and also just in general sort of design cues. So there are minimum requirements for how much contrast an element has to have for it to be considered accessible. There's also minimum font sizes, and there's combinations of font sizes and colors also. And it's very important too for buttons to be correctly coded and colored. Many people ask us, even when they're not talking about accessibility, they say, well, what is the most effective link color, button color, or what have you? And really, there isn't one. The thing that matters with buttons and links is contrast. Even outside of accessibility issues, contrast is super key for those items. You want those items to be clear, easily used, and you want to avoid important icons or design cues that may not be accessible. And not everything in the design really has to fall under that. There are some things that are outside of what the rules kind of state. But the easiest way to like your logo doesn't necessarily have to have the right contrast, because it's not technically covered under those things. Stuff like that is exempt. However, it's always great if everyone can see your logo. And if any part of the design is actually important to understanding the content or using the content or using the page, that does need to be accessible. So a quick tool that's on a website is this from WebAIM. AIM, that stands for Accessibility in Mind. This is a resource tool we'll go back to later. Phenomenal resource if you want to know the rules for contrast, font size, those things. This is a tool you can plug your colors into and your font sizes, and it will let you know if it has enough contrast. So the contrast needed is quite high. It's higher than most people really expect. The wave tool, also the most common thing, like you see in this, there's this one page, they have called out 37 contrast errors. So that's a super common issue with design is contrast. So especially if your brand colors are not super contrasting, and maybe you don't need to necessarily change your whole brand, but having colors in there that's part of the palette you can use is very important. Part of our standard sort of audit that we go through includes a whole review of all your brand colors and whether they pass or fail with combinations of text and white text, black text, things like that. So the design is pretty important. And then the content is another area we see a lot of issues. And making accessible content, a major part of it is your images and your links. Your images need to they have what they call alt tags, which is basically a good description of what this image is supposed to be. And that can be accessed by these other tools and screen readers. And that can, that can really enhance the experience for the user, and then links need really good descriptive anchor text too that will of course say what that link is going to do. You don't want links that just say click here or learn more or things that are generic that this screen reader is going to read over and over. That won't really help the user. And then of course, video should always be closed captioned. And with things like YouTube now, that's built in. There's a tool you can use that's very easy to use. And don't forget about files like PDFs or other downloads or other tools you may use, form building tools, your donation platform, other things you link out to, or other files you're hosting. All of those should be accessible as well. So that's an important thing to think about. So here's an example with the wave tool describing this image, woman on a couch with dog and coffee. So that's pretty good. I would have said even what breed. I would have said, cute beagle puppy on couch with dog, and coffee. That's just, I have a preference for beagles. So, but that's a very important thing is these alt tags to describe the images. Here is kind of just a quick example, the YouTube closed caption system, which is awesome. For English, it's completely automatic. You can hit a button, it will build the transcript, and then you can go in and edit. And it will probably make some mistakes, but it's a very easy interface for editing your closed captions and building them. So there really shouldn't be any excuse, if you're using YouTube for not having accessible videos. Also, if you're doing files like PDFs, I recommend PDFs definitely over other file types. Say you have to do some kind of external document. You're going to host an ebook, a case study, something. You want it to look nice. There is an accessibility checker and tool built into Adobe's Acrobat Pro PDF tool. So make sure if you're going to rely on PDFs, documents like that, that you use that and you look at that. I'm going to switch this poll quick too. We have a bunch more to get through. So I'm going to answer those at your leisure. Now we'll kind of get into a little bit. We're getting to the end of the basics, and then we can get into this discussion. But a huge part too of accessibility is the function. How does your site function? So we're talking about forms, how forms, like I talked briefly about that search form that did not work so well on that website. So pop-ups, if you have pop-ups, if you have chat and kind of more interactive features, and your site search, those things also should be accessible. And you have to be careful if you use other tools, like say you're going to use Salesforce for nonprofits or HubSpot, or you're going to use other tools, and you may be building forms or embedding forms, say from your donation platform. Check those as well. So with forms, there can be a lot of tricky things. There's be coding in those forms that will assist that software and hardware of correctly using the form. And for things that are super interactive, like pop-ups or other things that are coming up on the screen, they need to make sure that they receive what's called focus. So a really bad thing with pop-ups is someone could be using a page with a screen reader. If a pop-up comes up and it prevents the rest of the site being used, and to address that pop-up, if the pop-up doesn't automatically receive what they call focus, then it's going to kind of break the whole site for that user. They're not going to be able to continue using that until you refresh it, um, or get rid of the pop-up somehow. And another thing that comes into play, and you can see here's a bunch of here's another screenshot of the code. So you can see this tool also has code that can be pulled up, and there's that code at the bottom describing the form label. So looking at that form labels are critical, and that label is what's read by screen readers. And then when you get into much more interactivity, there's something called ARIA, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Application. And ARIA really comes into play with more complicated things. Say you have an online donation or billing. Say you're a big company, you have an online pay your bill system, or you're building sort of a much more interactive website. ARIA is very good for that. And a lot of forms now that have validation or data goes back and forth, or fields appear or disappear depending upon your selections, that is getting into an area of interactivity where ARIA can be very helpful. It's not necessarily strictly just for web applications, but that's its most typical use. Usually you don't need that. Usually you don't need ARIA. Usually, for instance, with forms, having the labels and all the other basic coding done is okay. And a lot of special devices, screen readers, other applications also are not yet completely fully HTML5 compatible, and ARIA is an HTML5 only thing. So if you do care, say you have a website with just some forms and things that's not really an application, and you really care about accessibility, you may be better off sticking with the standard stuff supported for forms rather than ARIA, just if you care about the widest compatibility possible with devices. So that's kind of all the basics, design, structure, design, content, interactivity. Those are the main buckets that these issues kind of fall into.